Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
I'm Kim Flatham.
And I'm Kirsten Traynor.
Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hive's protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
Hey, thanks, Sherry. We want to thank Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today, and while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping, Your First 3 Years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms as sponsor of this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinator insects, both wild and managed, before they disappear. Learn more from our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with editor and our guest co-host today, Kirsten Traynor, and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with a number 2. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us. We have a great show lined up today with Kirsten. Kirsten, who are you talking with?
Today I had the opportunity to chat with Madeleine Ostwald, who's a graduate student at Arizona State University. And she's absolutely fascinating because she did her undergrad with Tom Seeley in Cornell, then popped across the ocean to do some work in Scotland, and now is in the deserts of Arizona. So she has had lots of experience with different bee species.
Sounds exciting.
It does. Wow. Where did you find her? Oh, probably you met her at Arizona?
Actually, I met her because when I was putting my first issue together, Craig Childs, who writes about following bees into the desert, cites her research. And so I had reached out to Tom Seeley and Michael Smith, her 2 co-authors, and they put me in touch with Maddie, who I didn't even know was at Arizona State. And she ended up writing a companion piece for my very first issue.
Small world, isn't it?
It is a very small world sometimes.
It is. It's right around the corner. You're in Berlin. So how's it going in Berlin? Did you start your research? How's COVID? How's it all going?
The COVID numbers here are far better than they are anywhere in the United States. So people still wear masks when going into stores and on public transportation, but otherwise it's pretty relaxed. My research has started. We ordered in some nukes so that we're going to have the bees available, and we're having a custom-made observation hive built to hold these extra wide frames because we're going to have a robot bee dancing in there. And then it's been a really cool and wet week. It's been in the 60s to 70s with some rainstorms here and there. So it's been a lot of fun.
You know, when you talk about robot bee dancing, all I could think of is something from the Jetsons, or just something with very angular arms, just herky-jerky around on the frames. So, well, I'm sure that'll be really interesting. Maybe you can share some videos of that at some point.
And share some of your cool weather.
Yeah, the weather's been lovely, so.
All right. Well, before we get going with Kirsten's interview with Maddie, let's next week we will be talking with USDA's Dr. Jay Evans about his upcoming book, Bee Optimism. And this week, Kim has a review of his book.
Yeah, it's. I encourage people to get a copy of it. It's a great book.
All right. Well, let's listen to the review now.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. You know, the book review we're going to do today is Bee Optimism by Jay Evans. We're going to be speaking with Jay here pretty quick, and I wanted to get his book out. It's published by IBRA and Northern Bee Books. IBRA is that group of in the UK that he's on the board of, and of course Northern Bee Books is Jeremy Burbidge, who we talked to a while back. So the title of the book is Bee Optimism: Translational Research Can Rescue Honeybees and Other Pollinators. It's a long title, but Dr. Jay Evans, as you probably know, is the research leader of the USDA Honeybee Research Lab in Beltsville, Maryland. He writes a monthly column for Bee Culture magazine called Found in Translation. He started that a few years back when I was editor there, and I found his articles interesting, easy to read, and popular with our readers. So what he's done is he's taken 34 of those articles that he's already published, and he's tweaked them updated some or a lot, and gathered them into 5 chapters, with each chapter containing a collection of related articles, kind of giving each a sort of different focus. The 5 chapters are Challenges and Opportunities, Sweetness and Light, Royal Decrees, Climate Change, and a closing. Challenges and Opportunities looks at issues surrounding viruses and their mutations. Talks about Sam Ramsey's work with fat bodies. It looks at stress and how it challenges the immune system, a bee's behavior, and shortens a bee's life. He follows foragers with RFID tags, talks about probiotics and nosema and pesticides. It covers a lot, maybe most of what's troubling our bees and beekeepers at the moment. The second chapter is Sweetness and Light, and it's about honey. Mostly about honey. There's some other things in there. Pollen DNA ID for honey, early harvested versus late harvested honey differences. He looks at propolis and the role that it plays in the health of a colony, and a bit about soybean pollination, believe it or not. He went all the way back to the work that I did in Madison 40-some years ago. Royal Decrees looks at queen replacement, the effects of mites on queen development, larva choices by the bees when replacing a queen, and a look at how solitary bees handle all of this, because some of them are a lot different, some of them are very similar. Climate change covers a lot of topics you probably didn't consider very often. He looks at the historical record of weather patterns and compares those to honey production and overwintering success in various parts of the world. He looks at the effects of rain, temperature, that can be predictive of losses next spring, and he looks at the superorganism of a whole hive in response to these events, not just individual honeybees. And he looks at stresses from habitat, climate, and disease stresses combined over long periods of times, and he takes a look at long-time pollen collection, diversity, and what can be learned from these studies. He uses a phrase here that I found interesting. With all of this, scientists are looking for signals in the noise. But he's optimistic. It isn't all bad. There's lots of new beekeepers and lots of new researchers, new methods, treatments, and diagnostics in the works. Brand new collections of data available in the cloud from individuals, from colony-level studies, data collection organizations, and research, all available to decipher some answers in the noise. I was lucky to have Jay approach me with his idea for his column, and I think I was wise enough to say yes, we are smarter and better because he raised his hand.
Welcome to Beekeeping Today, a podcast all about bees. I'm guest host Kirsten Traynor, editor of the quarterly magazine 2 Million Blossoms, Protecting Our Pollinators. Today, I'm chatting with Madeleine Ostwald, a graduate student at ASU. Maddie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's always a blast talking with a bee scientist. Can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and how you first became interested in bees?
Yeah, of course. So, like you said, I'm currently a grad student at ASU, and so I'm studying animal behavior and working with bees. And so I'm working in the lab of Jennifer Fuel, which has a focus on studying cooperative behaviors in social insect societies, so like colonies of bees and ants. And then, of course, my particular interest is in bees. And so I first became interested in bees way back when I was in high school, and I got a job teaching science programs to kids at a children's museum. And so
how fascinating.
Yeah. So it's this really great job. And I had the pleasure of teaching a program on honeybees using a honeybee observation hive. And so just spending all this time with this hive, I just became really obsessed with watching these bees whenever I was at work and trying to sort of understand what they were doing and especially like how the whole colony was working together. So then by the time I started college a couple years later, I knew that I really wanted to study bees because I couldn't stop reading about them and I had all these questions about them.
And so you ended up doing your Bachelor of Science with Tom Seeley at Cornell. What was it like working in the Seeley lab?
Yeah, so working in the Seeley lab was such an awesome experience and a really formative experience for me in my sort of early research career. So Tom, of course, is a really outstanding scientist who's really inspiring to work with because he's so passionate about bees and about studying behavior. And he really loves his study organism and the work that he does, but also just because he's just a really kind and wonderful person and mentor who somehow sort of manages to make time for all these different responsibilities of an academic, but then still takes time to do things like work alongside young scientists, like undergraduates, like I was at the time. And so he'll be like really out in the field or in the lab collecting data with them. So that was a really kind of...
That must be so nice to have your advisor hands-on in the field with you.
Right.
I know one conversation I had with Tom Seeley many years ago was that he emphasized the importance of observation and how before you set up any experiment and start tinkering, you better first just watch and see what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that was like really sort of powerful for me to see. It's one thing to have your advisor tell you to do something and another to see them doing that and then sort of want to like model your own work after that. So that was this really, really like, lovely introduction, not only to the area of research that I'm interested in, but also in, like you said, that sort of, that spirit of scientific research as being sort of curiosity driven and collaborative and fun. And as something that being something I'd like to model my own work and career after.
Very cool. And a big part of colony health comes down to efficient thermoregulation. Bees are, of course, really good at regulating temperature, especially to survive the long, harsh winters that you guys have up in Cornell. You could kind of say that honeybees are masters at keeping the temperature just right. We all know they collect nectar and pollen, but they also spend a good bit of energy collecting water. What can you tell us about those water collectors?
Yeah, so this was kind of my major undergraduate project when I was at Cornell. And so this is kind of motivated by the fact that, we tend to think the most about bees that are collecting nectar and pollen, that those are really the important things that they need to survive. But of course, like any animals, they also need water. And so how they get that water has been a bit overlooked in the past, even though it turns out that it's really important for their survival. So, like you mentioned, water is really important for regulating the temperature inside the nest. So bees will actually regurgitate droplets of water and smear them across their combs and then fan their wings to make the water evaporate. And then the temperature drops due to evaporative cooling. So that's one of the main cooling mechanisms in the nest. And it's totally dependent on how much water the colony has. So we would do this. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it's a little bit like the mister systems in Arizona when you're sitting out in the hot sun and it feels a little cooler.
Exactly like that. Yeah. So we had the sense that it was really important, but to really test that, we did a series of experiments where we put a colony inside a greenhouse so that we could totally control their access to water. So they couldn't leave the greenhouse. And in there, we could also heat them up with a heat lamp to make the colony really hot and thirsty. And so then we were able to take away their only water source and find that the temperature of the brood nest shoots up really high to temperatures that are dangerous for the brood that they can't survive at. But then as soon as we brought the water back, the colony was able to bring the temperature back down to safe levels. So that gave us the idea that water was really essential to this cooling response.
Right. And you, I believe you also had bees that were acting almost as little storage vessels for this water.
Yeah. So we found that some of the bees that are doing the water collection will, like you said, be storing water almost like living, water vessels. And we would call them water bottle bees. And so we would find at the end of this really hot day that we had artificially created, we'd see a line on the edge of the brood nest of really engorged bees full of water, just lined up.
Bloated bees that were just sort of hanging out on the edge of the brood nest. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So just kind of, waiting to sort of jump into action if the colony gets thirsty again. So, and that way the colony is then buffered against a future crisis.
Okay, so it's almost like they're keeping it in reserve just in case things heat up again.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. And how hard is it to remove all water sources from bees? Bees are pretty good at finding what they need.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So, like I said, we kept this colony in a greenhouse so that they couldn't leave the greenhouse. We thought we had completely controlled their environment by removing all water sources. And then we do this sort of first trial of the experiment after removing the water. So we thought we're still seeing lots of bees dancing on the dance floor of the observation nest. And so they must be getting water from somewhere, and we're kind of like scouring the greenhouse to find what they've found. And we find them in the inner ceiling of the greenhouse. There's like a little row of moss growing, and so they're sucking the water out of the moss that was growing inside the greenhouse and bringing it back to the nest.
So they used the natural sponge, and they were just taking big long sips.
Yeah, exactly. So we had to remove all the moss, and then at one point we found them. They had crawled inside the faucet of the sink, and we're getting some of the drops that were still inside the faucet. So
it's pretty ingenious. I mean, we have to give them credit for
exactly. Yeah, it's so funny when you try so hard to make this like carefully controlled environment, and I think that's actually one of the most sort of fun parts of working with honeybees is being constantly impressed by their ingenuity and sometimes being outsmarted by them.
Yeah, no, I fully concur. They have a way of getting out of crevices and into crevices, and you never quite know what they're going to do.
Right.
So, and then after college, I understand you went to Europe. What were you doing there?
So I have some background and some interest in history as well as in biology. So after my undergrad, I spent some time at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, getting my master's in an interdisciplinary history program. So my research there was on the history of entomology, which is the study of insects, with a focus on contributions from indigenous knowledge. So knowledge outside of those, traditional Western intellectual structures that we typically associate with knowledge production. And so I was analyzing this really interesting 16th century codex, this text that came out of Aztec Mexico, and which contains all these really amazing illustrations and information about native plant and animal life in Aztec Mexico. And it has a particular emphasis on insects, which were really culturally prominent there, kind of unlike in Europe at the time, where they were mostly sort of like reviled.
Right.
So that allowed me to do some comparative research on how different cultures perceive and interact with insects, and then how that worldview influences the way that they investigate them and understand them from a scientific perspective.
And so what kind of what kind of insects are featured in this Aztec manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, so many, and they have, they all have their own names and their own really unique illustrations associated with them. And I was particularly interested, of course, in the bees. And so stingless bees are really prominent in Mesoamerica, especially at this time when honeybees hadn't been introduced there yet. So they're managing stingless bees for honey production, much in the same way as Europeans at the time were managing honeybees.
So they had already figured out how to manage them and harvest honey from them.
Yeah,
because they don't produce very much.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. I know that stingless bee honey is often used for eye ailments in South America.
Yeah. That's another really interesting thing. It's like not just the bees, but all these insects seem to have these really complex medicinal associations. So, whereas, in Europe at the time, we kind of only think about honeybees as being sort of the only useful insect, and maybe, silk moths and things like that. But,
and leeches. I guess they loved their leeches in Europe.
Yeah. So it's kind of this idea that, the only insect worth having is one that benefits us in some tangible way. Whereas in these other cultures, insects were much more closely united to their daily lives and in their diet, in their mythology, in their medicine.
Okay.
And so I think that really impacts the way.
So were they harvesting them for food as well as a protein source?
Yeah, especially larvae, not the bees, but other insects.
Okay.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Better Bee is pleased to present the interviews by Kirsten Traynor. As a supplier to our nation's beekeepers for over 40 years, Better Bee provides the tools, equipment, and information you need to succeed. Through its many beekeeping employees, Better Bee serves you with solutions to your beekeeping challenges. That's why they can say with confidence that they are your partners in better beekeeping. Thanks to Better Bee for their informative catalog, website, supportive beekeeper education, and for sponsoring the series featuring Kirsten. Be sure to see the latest at betterbee.com.
And so from lush and green upstate New York to windswept Scotland, and then now in the dry deserts of Arizona, what prompted you to move to Arizona State University?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm here at ASU for my PhD, and I was really attracted to this program because ASU has a really excellent sort of cluster of labs that are all studying social insects. So there's a lot of bee research going on here that I was really interested in. And then sort of as an added benefit, this Northern Desert has really incredible native bee diversity. And it's thought to be one of the most, if not the most bee diverse region in the world. And there are over 1,000 species of native bees here. So
that's incredible.
Yeah. So it's this really unique habitat that bees tend to thrive in. So that's really great, obviously, for my research, and also just makes it a really cool place to live.
So 1,000, that's about a quarter of what we have in North America, or what we're estimated to have in North America.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I didn't realize it was quite that diverse.
Yeah.
So I understand you've been studying the Arizona carpenter bee. Many listeners are probably familiar with the big shiny bees that drill into their decks and fence posts back east. But the carpenter bees of Arizona set up home in different materials. Can you tell us more about them?
Sure. Yeah. So these bees are really interesting because, like you said, a lot of people regard them as actually a pest insect because they do often live in structural timber, like in people's houses or fences. So they can certainly do some damage, but it's usually really minor, and especially minor when you take into consideration the overall value of these bees as native pollinators. But what I'm really interested in is their social behavior, which is pretty unique. So I'm guessing probably a lot of listeners don't know that most bee species are actually solitary. So they don't live in big colonies like honeybees do. And you may know that honeybees evolved from solitary ancestors. So one big question in the field is, how do we get something as complex and impressive as a honeybee colony from a solitary bee, and why does that happen? So why did they ever start to cooperate in the first place, and what are the advantages of doing that?
Right. And for the solitary ones, I mean, there you have to do everything yourself. You have to forage, you have to rear your own young. There's no workers to help you out. So.
Yeah, exactly. So carpenter bees are actually really useful for asking this question because their social behavior is somewhere in between solitary bees and very social bees like honeybees, because carpenter bees, or at least certain species, can be either solitary or social under different conditions. So my research looks at what some of those conditions might be. So why is it advantageous to be alone in one environment, and then another you might get a lot of benefits from living with other bees?
So do they tend to cluster and live together when conditions get tough, or what are some of the underlying circumstances that get them to move towards a more social existence? Yeah,
great question. I think from my research, what I think of as being one of the most important drivers of this social behavior is limitation on access to nest sites. So like you mentioned, they live in people's decks and their fence posts, anywhere in wood. And the species I work with lives mainly, instead of in people's homes, it lives mostly in old logs and stumps, which can actually be pretty limiting in a desert environment. And And so to build a nest in one of these wood structures, we're finding actually takes a ton of energy. So carpenter bees might prefer to just wait around to inherit an existing nest instead of having to build their own when they're in such short supply. So this desire to avoid this really costly nest building behavior might be one of the things that's driving them to live in groups that are all, instead of making their own nests, they're all just fighting over the nests that already exist.
Okay. And so it's sort of the lack of nest building material, and also it's just easier to improve what's already there. And then do these nests change over time? And how do you even study that?
Yeah, so that was one thing we're really interested in is how these nests change over time. Like you said, bees are constantly updating and maybe modifying the existing nests instead of building new ones. So there's a potential for a lot of change over time. And so the way that scientists typically study nest architecture is by just breaking open, a log with a bunch of nests in it and seeing how it looks, which can be really informative, but also has this limitation where if you break something apart, you can't, come back a year later and see how it's changed. So to avoid that, we wanted to kind of see what was going on inside the log without disturbing it or destroying the homes of these bees. So we were able to do that actually using a CT scanner, like the same one that you would use if you're in the hospital as a patient. So our local hospital here allowed us to use their CT scanner. So we would bring in our carpenter bee logs and every 2 months scan the same logs and get some really cool, 3D images of the inside of the nest.
So are you like sneaking them in on a gurney under a sheet or in the stealth of the night?
Yeah, actually that's not too far from the truth. So we would go in the middle of the night because that's, when the CT scan is
the quiet
busy.
hours.
Yeah. And then, we would kind of, like you said, just sort of wrap up the log to not, alarm anybody by bringing 100 live bees into a hospital.
That's so fascinating. No, this is just this is in the name of research. Ignore what's going by.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting though, that a hospital was able to coordinate with scientists and use technology. How did you guys get in touch?
We just reached out over email, and they were really really accommodating and excited about the research. And I think it was sort of a lesson to me that it's worth trying to pursue these interesting channels of communication with people who are somewhat outside of our field, and the ways that we might sort of help each other. Things.
And I'm sure they were pumping you for questions. They must have been so fascinated.
Yeah. Sometimes there would be like a small crowd of technicians watching.
So, and do the nests then change quite a bit between those 2 months where you haven't looked at them?
Yeah, they absolutely do. So we would scan these logs once every 2 months for a year, and saw these huge changes in the size and the shape of the nest. They might expand to be sort of double the size they were initially. And that's all part of these renovations I mentioned, where bees are repurposing existing nests to suit their needs instead of building new nests. And one of the most important ways that they change is that the nests tend to get a little bit wider every year as they're used as part of the way that they construct the nest to accommodate their brood. So every year they get a little bit wider, and these wider tunnels are then more likely to be abandoned by the bees. They're sort of less desirable than the new narrow tunnels. And so we think that's probably because, wide tunnels are really difficult to defend from invaders, and carpenter bees are like constantly under threat from invading other carpenter bees. So because there's this really intense competition over access to nests, there's a lot of one bee might usurp the nest from another bee, and then she'll move to a different nest and try to take over there. And so they'll do that by invading each other's nests and kicking out their brood and starting to lay their own eggs. So having a structure that you're able to defend is really important.
Okay. And so since they're carpenter bees, they can probably make tunnels bigger, but they have no way of packing them back in and making them smaller.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's when you would, if all the tunnels are too wide, that's when you might make your own branch off of the old tunnel and just use that. So that's how they get kind of bigger and bigger and more branched over time.
Okay. And have you done genetic analysis on them as well? Are they all related?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with bees and a lot of social insects in general, we tend to think of these big colonies as being like really large extended families. But in some systems, we're starting to find that might not be the case. They might just be groups of non-relatives. And we're starting to think that might be the case in carpenter bees. There's some evidence for that in another species of carpenter bee. And in the species that I work with, some of my preliminary data is starting to suggest that bees might be living, not necessarily with their sisters like a honeybee colony would, but just with whoever might happen to be in the nest at that time, because there's this constant switching, like I mentioned, where they're always trying to take over their neighbor's nest. So that's kind of waiting on a little bit more analysis when the labs reopen, but that's sort of what we're starting to think now, is that they're not actually living in family groups.
How fascinating. Best of luck with it. I'm sure it will continue to reveal all sorts of unknowns.
Thank you.
Many of our listeners love hearing about bee science. What do you enjoy most about your research?
Yeah, what I love about my research in particular is getting this opportunity to work, outside in nature and to really interact so closely with the actual animals that I'm interested in and in the actual habitats where they live. So, and I kind of imagine this is what draws a lot of people to beekeeping, as well as this cool and kind of unique opportunity to really, physically hold in your hands this animal that you have this intense curiosity about, and which makes you wonder, what she's doing and why she's doing that. And I think we all sort of innately ask these questions when we're watching an animal. And I think it's so fun and satisfying to have a job where I can ask those questions and even sometimes get answers to those questions. So I think bees especially offer this really cool opportunity to see how an entire society functions just on the scale of, something in your own backyard or something like that. So I think not a lot of people, even other biologists, get the chance to see that in their work.
Very, very, very cool. And I fully concur. It's sort of this endless curiosity that keeps you going back for more. And even though sometimes there are long hours in the hot desert sun,
right,
and you're under layers of protective clothing, it still makes you want to come back.
Yeah.
So one final question. If you had to pick a pollinator avatar to represent you online, what would you go with?
I would have to say a carpenter bee. Yeah, I could never pick anything else.
Fair enough. And what's the scientific name of the carpenter bee you study?
Xylocopa sonorina.
Sonorina.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, is that for based on the sound? What does the sonorina stand for?
Okay, great question. It's actually kind of a long story so until, April, it was Xylocopa varipuncta.
Okay.
So I'd gone, my whole degree thinking, calling it that, and I have to adjust to this new name. But so there's some new, DNA barcoding evidence that these two species that we thought were different are actually the same bee. And then sonorina is the name that takes precedence. So sonorina was this carpenter bee found, we thought, just in Hawaii. But this evidence is now showing that it originated over here in the Western US and made its way over to Hawaii. So they're all the same species, and now they're all called sonorina.
How fascinating.
So
I wonder how it got to Hawaii.
Yeah, I know. It's probably on some wood on a ship or something like that.
Yeah. Wow. The more we learn.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you, Maddie, so much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and good luck with the rest of your summer of research.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Hey, Kirsten, that was really fun. She sounds like she's got a lot going there.
She does. She's always a joy to talk with. And I think it's wonderful that they were able to convince the hospital to work with them.
That was I can't imagine taking a log into a hospital in the middle of the night to have a CAT scan.
So, yeah, she's actually sent me some photos. They wrap them up in these big, heavy-duty black trash bags. And then one of the people working it, she asked him, "What's the strangest thing you've ever had come into your CAT scanner?" And he responded, "This is definitely it."
I can believe it.
I can see it running through the ER, stat, doctor, stat, and running through with the bells and whistles and taking a log into the CAT scanner. That's funny. I found it really interesting. We have a bird bath on our back, and I always sit there and watch the bees tank up with water and fly back. In a couple minutes, they're back again. So I found what her research about the water carriers was really interesting, and how it's such a dedicated role and the importance of those bees in the hive.
Yeah, I find it fascinating how easily they can find water, even when you think you've removed it all.
That was pretty good. Moss down in the crack there. She had to dig up.
Yeah.
You know the thing, and I don't know if this is well known or not. I wasn't aware of how they put water on their wings, and then vibrate their wings to have the water dissipate in the hive. That I've never seen it, and I've never heard anybody mention it.
All right, well, that about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. Even better, write a review and let us know what you like. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their continued sponsorship of Beekeeping Today podcast. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. We want to thank Kirsten's sponsor, Better Bee. Thank you, Better Bee, for being there, and check them out at www.betterbee.com. And finally, before we go, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, Kirsten, hey, Kim, anything else we should mention?
Well, Jeff, you just said it, and I think we should reinforce it as questions and comments. Go to the webpage and drop us a note if you got something somebody you want to hear, something you want to say, got a comment on something that we've already done. We'd love to hear from you. The more we hear from you, the better we can do.
I was just going to say that I know listeners have been flooding Adam's inbox since we did the Heroes to Hive interview with him, and he's been getting lots of feedback from lots of people interested in the veterans program.
Oh, that's really good. All right. Well, thank you. We'll see you next week.
Take it easy, Jeff.
Thank you.